Two people were asleep. Someone had entered the bedroom, fired bullets into the two victims, and he set the house on fire.
This really isn't the kind of crime that you see in small towns. It's an execution. In the 3 years leading up to their death, the Kalishnikovs had been in like a lot of legal disputes.
He said Greg talked about hiring a hitman to take care of the Kalishnikovs.
Our question isn't who had motive, because a lot of people had motive.
He had 26 eviction lawsuits that he had filed.
This is about which one of them did it. Cookeville is like a college town. It's close enough to Nashville that there's, stuff going on. You've got access to culture and art.
A little bit urban and a little bit country.
You got a bunch of good old country folks. I can say that my family is.
Shoot your gun when you want, play music where you want, drive off the road where you want.
What's really beautiful about this area is that it is the heartland of America. You could come here with whatever dream you have, and with hard work, the dreams are realized. You see a lot of that in Tennessee. In the case that we're looking into here, different people in this community all had big dreams, and some of them went horribly wrong. Victor Kalishnikov and his wife Alla were a couple from the Ukraine, and the community members here referred to them as the foreigners, or the Germans, or the Russians. Nobody could quite put their finger on what their background was. They retired here, and it was their American dream, and they started working in real estate and really saw the potential in a beautiful place like this. But in 1998, the Kalishnikovs were murdered here in Cookeville, and to this day, there are a number of people in the community who still feel like justice hasn't been served.
Number one?
Yes. I live out on Poplar Grove Road.
Yes.
There's a house on fire.
The call come in from a neighbor across the street.
It's Victor's house. We heard a big boom.
The fire department arrived. At that time, there was no indication that anybody was in the house.
There's nobody stirring about. I'm going to make a sweep around the house right quick. I can't get close enough to the house to check. I got power lines fixing to fall off the house here. It's fully involved. I can't hardly get close enough for it.
By the time the fire was suppressed, the house suffered massive damage. Local departmental investigators called for assistance from the state fire marshal's office. I was one of the first team members to arrive.
The skeletal remains of the house are still smoldering from a fire that started around 3:30 a.m. Wednesday morning. State fire marshal investigators sift through the ashes looking for clues.
We entered into the house. There was massive damage. The roof over the bedroom was completely burned away. And there were two bodies on the bed. Both people were dead from gunshot wounds. We recovered several 9mm rounds from in and around the body. An accelerant had been poured in the room, and the house was set on fire.
This was no random fire. This was intentional to cover up the murders. My name is Linda Bausman. At the time of the murders, I was judicial assistant for an appellate court judge. When law enforcement spoke with the neighbors, they didn't know much. No one saw a person there. There really wasn't much for law enforcement to go on.
Working in a small town in law enforcement, everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows everybody's business. You know, our job was just to dig up the facts that we could find.
Like a lot of small-town murders, this case didn't get a lot of national attention. The only person who really covered it extensively was Rabia Chaudhry with her podcast, Undisclosed. I really hope Rabia can give us a framework for understanding this very complex small-town case.
Hello?
Hi, Hillary.
Hi, Rabia, how are you?
Good, how are you? Nice to meet you.
You did so much research, so what can you tell us about this case?
It was a pretty horrifying crime, the way they were killed. The house was set on fire. I mean, it caught, the attention of the TBI. They got involved, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. They were the lead on this case.
What was the immediate response from investigators the morning of the fire?
One of the first people they talked to was Victor's sister. And the first thing she told them was that he was in the process of suing this guy named Greg Lance. Greg bought a trailer park from Victor as a direct buy.
Greg Lance purchased the property from Victor and Alla, and they loaned him like $375,000.
At the time of the murders, Victor was in the process of foreclosing on the trailer park for unpaid taxes, and Greg was challenging it in court. 2 days prior to the hearing is when the murders happened. At this point, law enforcement believes that the trailer park was a motive for the murders of the Kalishnikovs.
The morning of the murders, the investigators started looking at the trailer park that Victor Kalishnikov had sold to Greg Lance. Now, at this trailer park, there's a house at the entrance where Greg lives with his girlfriend Becky, his friend and the property manager Keith, and Keith's girlfriend Kay.
I'm Kay Sanders, and I'm a friend of Greg Lance's. That trailer park was like living in a totally different land. They were like their own little family. They all would get together and talk about each other. Most of these people were struggling, doing the best that they could. A lot of people would call it the slums of Cookeville. And I know Greg was always working hard at trying to improve the look of the trailer park. Greg was about 26, 27. I was shocked that he owned the trailer park because he was so young. Keith Herbstreth worked for Greg Lance. He ran the trailer park for him. Keith and Greg were really good friends. Cops showed up and wanting to talk to everybody. A man comes over and talks to Greg and Keith and lets them know that Mr. and Mrs. Kalishnikov had been murdered. Bob Kropsic was running the investigation. He was the TBI agent. He went through Greg's room. He was going through the house, and they were just pulling drawers out and going through everything.
Greg let them search the house. There was nothing in the house, no evidence. There was just nothing there. They asked Greg where he was on the night of the murders. Greg was out at Happy Days bar. He came home about 1 o'clock, and he and Becky went to bed. And Becky was able to verify Greg's alibi.
An hour or two later, Bob Kropsic was telling us not to leave town. We were all scared.
So after this whole day of questioning Greg and everyone else surrounding him in the trailer park, investigators are not able to piece together anything.
There's nothing connecting Greg to the crime at all. Not a witness, not forensics, nothing.
But Rabia, was there anybody else who was also having financial difficulty with Victor?
Oh, definitely. Victor was very litigious. I mean, I know at the time of his death, he had 26 outstanding eviction lawsuits that he had filed against tenants.
That's a lot of people in his orbit that all need to be looked at.
Yeah. Victor and Alla would do these rent-to-buy options with tenants.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would find a reason to renege on the contract to get the property back.
So it could have been any number of people who were angry with the Kalishnikovs. We're heading over to meet up with Linda Bozeman, who is a really cool woman. She had been a judicial assistant in the courts and dug up information that no one else had been able to find. She, more than anybody, has a really firm grasp on the details of this case and a lot of knowledge about where things might have gone wrong. I can't even imagine like tackling this without all of the work that you have done, because it's so much.
There's a lot here, and there's so many layers. It was about 2002 when I became involved in the case, and then it became an obsession, and I was so determined that I was going to solve this puzzle.
Talk to me a little bit about what happened at the Kalishnikov house.
Early on.
Yeah.
They had no real clue of who had committed the murders. If they had known, they would have made an arrest.
Yeah.
Cookeville's a small town. A lot of people here are related to each other. A lot of gossip here about what went on during that time period. A lot of things being told around the trailer park that may or may not be true.
There's a rumor every 2 feet. You know, we followed the leads that were presented to us. You know, some of them are just outlandish. There was discussion of the Russian mafia and that somebody followed up on it and it went nowhere.
A couple weeks had passed and there was no evidence of any kind that indicated who had done the murders. There was nothing.
They don't find a murder weapon or any evidence.
Nothing.
There doesn't seem to be any forward momentum.
And then the governor of Tennessee offered a reward.
And so when that reward gets announced, what's the next thing that happens?
The day that the reward was announced, some people called law enforcement and told them that they had heard shooting at one of their neighbors' farms the weekend before the murders. The farm was empty, and they were concerned. They told the TBI that they had walked the property over there, had gone up into the barn, and that there were 2 military-type gas cans. They said that the day before the murders, the gas cans were still there in the barn, but that the day of the murders, they were gone. This farm was owned by Mike Herron, a friend of Greg's.
And Greg Lance is the guy buying the trailer park from Victor Kalishnikov.
Our team was activated along with several investigators from the sheriff's office and TBI. We responded out to the farm and we conducted a search of the farm. My primary responsibility was in and around the shed. Some of the things we noted was there was a fresh area of the wall that had just been randomly cut out. It stood out like a sore thumb. I was born and raised on a farm, live on a farm now, and I can think of no reason to just go cut a hole in my barn. And it appeared that the wall, somebody had tried to set it on fire. That rung everybody's bell. We found this little fire pit, which was right outside of the building where that hole was cut. And we sifted the debris. We found in and around there multiple shell casings and bullets. Most of the bullets were 9mm. They were sent to the lab and linked to the murder scene. The murder weapon was fired at both locations. My opinion is that target practice was done with the murder weapon at the farm in preparation for committing a murder, and they used fire to obscure any evidence of target practice.
So at this point, law enforcement was focusing on Greg, and they spoke to an individual who said that he saw Greg on the farm target practicing.
On August 2nd, the day that there's gunfire at the Herron farm.
Right.
And they matched bullets found at the Herron farm to the crime scene.
Yes.
That looks really bad for Greg.
Up until this point, there was no firearm recovered in the case. They had no real suspects, although they were looking at Greg.
September 17th, not too far from the crime scene, a weapon was recovered in a ditch. The weapon was a Tech 9 9mm, but now with the flashlight taped to it. It is outfitted for a tactical environment, nighttime operations.
It's not a farm gun.
No.
You know what I mean? It's like a gun that's only meant to kill people.
It's more like, right.
It's like an automatic weapon.
An assault weapon.
The weapon was sent to the lab. Each weapon will leave unique marks. Bullets that were fired at the farm and fired at the house when the murder occurred were fired through that weapon.
Keith Herbstreit, the manager of the trailer park, and Greg's friend was brought in for questioning. They showed him a picture of the gun and the rope that was on the gun.
When investigators show Keith this, what does Keith tell investigators?
Keith said that he recognized the green cord on the gun, that this was the same cord that he and Greg had used to tie firecrackers up with on the 4th of July. From the photos, it looked like there were black smudges on the cord, and so Keith thought
that the cord on the gun or the cord that they tied the firecrackers, that they were one and the same.
So Keith says that cord belonged to Greg. Those black smudges are because of our fireworks.
Right.
Seems like we've connected him to the murder weapon.
Right. From that point on, that's who they focused on, and they never looked around to anyone else.
Bob Kropsic was running the investigation. I recall he pretty well told me that he knew that Greg had killed these people. He took Keith and I down at the Waffle House. Keith made the statement that Greg said that he was not going to win the case against the Kolesnikovs and that he thought he was going to have to do away with them. I couldn't believe that Keith was making statements against Greg because I always thought they were pretty much like brothers.
When they arrested Greg, it was heartbreaking and terrifying. My name is Joyce Argo. I'm Greg Lance's mother. Greg was an ambitious young man. He went to the National Guard, and from there he was able to get a VA loan and buy property. He did very well with it. He also became a contractor. Greg was in construction. He married Becky. They had a daughter. He was anxious to live his life. When they brought him into the courthouse and his hands chained, it became real, very real fast. Unless you have actually experienced it with your own child, I don't think you can understand the hurt of seeing your son in chains. I'm sorry.
The evidence they have against him, can you walk me through that?
When the trial began, prosecution's theory of the case is that Greg killed the Kolesnikovs in order to be able to keep the trailer park.
Keith testified against Greg that Greg is upset over the foreclosure and that Greg talked to him about hiring a hitman to take care of the Kolesnikovs.
So Keith rolls on Greg. The next person that talks about Greg is who?
Rocky Harmon.
Okay. And
Greg's lifelong friend.
That's a tough blow.
That's a tough blow. He said Greg, and he talked about Rocky
hiring a hitman.
They also talked to
Mike Snow. Mike Snow testified that Greg tried to get him to hire someone to kill the Kalishnikovs. He said that when Mike told him that it would take $10,000, Greg said, "I'm not paying $10,000.
And then who do we have?
Eric Tanner. Eric's testimony was that Greg talked to him about getting a gun, an untraceable gun.
Okay, that looks bad.
It looks bad.
The evidence they have against him is the testimony of...
The 4 individuals?
Yeah. A connection to a nylon cord, shooting practice at the Heron Farm.
Mm-hmm. It's very circumstantial.
The closing argument of the prosecutor. He said, when you have one coincidence, okay. When you've got 2, it starts to get a little strange. When you've got 3 and 4, that's when they're no longer coincidences.
When the trial was over and the jury was called back in, I couldn't believe my ears when they said that he was guilty. It was like the breath was just mashed out of me. Greg is sentenced to 2 life sentences.
Right now, we are meeting up with Greg Lance's mom, Joyce, who has been his biggest advocate. And so I'm really eager to hear what she has to say. Hi.
Hey, I wanted you to see this first. Our beautiful courthouse,
It is
town
beautiful.
square. I love the words up there. In God we trust.
You've got to.
You are in a Bible Belt.
Yeah, I am in the, I grew up in it. I grew up in the church. Right now, you're taking me where?
To the Heron Farm. This is where they said Greg was when there was shooting going on. Give it some gas and let's get on up that hill.
They found shell casings on the property here that seemingly matched the murder weapon. How do we know there was shooting here?
The neighbor said that they heard shooting here.
So they made that phone call at like 2:30 in the afternoon?
Yes, yes, yes.
A witness said that he saw Greg between 3 and 4, but that was hours after the neighbor said the shooting stopped and police had already cleared the scene.
That weekend that they are saying that Greg was here, he was actually in a guard duty in Gordonsville. Now his records can show that, that he was there.
His sergeant and other officers confirmed he was there though, right?
Yes, yes. Then when he got home, Keith and his girlfriend at that time, Kay, they can both tell you that Greg was at the trailer park that afternoon.
So he had a proven alibi elsewhere.
Right.
I know for a fact that Greg Lance could not have been at the Heron Farm around 2:30 on that day shooting because I got home from work about 2:30. He was not there shooting. He was right there at the house talking to Keith.
When I first looked at this, what intrigued me was that the puzzle pieces didn't fit. There were just too many things that were unanswered. So when Joyce asked me if I would help with Greg's case, I could not let her just try to get through this on her own.
We wanted her help because we did not understand the legal jargon in order to get a new trial.
We talked to witnesses. We really started to take a deep dive into what went on here in Putnam County. We have found out that lots of witnesses against Greg were either offered a deal to get out of criminal charges or in some way threatened.
Greg had made the mistake of hiring people that had a past, had records.
Greg would hire people that needed help with money because he was the type that would give the shirt off of his back. He moved Keith into his home because Keith was living in his car eating out of trash cans when he met Greg.
So when investigators started questioning him and putting pressure on these people, then they started saying, well, Greg may have done this or Greg might have done that.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the kind of people that Greg had surrounded himself with?
Yeah, a number of the folks had certain vulnerabilities that made them easy to lean on them and threaten them. Rocky Harmon, as soon as he testified, wrote Greg a number of letters saying, I'm so sorry I did that. They were pressuring me, I was scared. And Rocky, since sadly is deceased, but I spoke to his brother, and his brother was like, he was terrified because the police barged into his house and threatened him. Then you had Mike Snow. He was incarcerated at the time. Police took a statement from him, and then they immediately released him once he gave the statement.
Keith was kind of a weak person. Bob Crofts, the TBI agent, and Keith were doing a whole lot of talking. Keith would say things that he wanted to hear because they were telling him he was a suspect.
Interviewing witnesses is a tricky affair. You don't put words in a person's mouth. They have to tell you their own recollection. And I know that every one of the investigators who investigated this were men of integrity.
I don't think that Keith believed Greg had killed anybody. They had this piece of rope, and they made Keith believe it was the rope that he used to hang in a tree to put firecrackers on. He believed the rope wrapped around the gun was the rope that he had hung in the tree.
6 years after Greg is convicted, Keith attempts to prove to himself that the cord that was found on the murder weapon is the same cord that he and Greg had used to tie up fireworks.
This reenactment was entirely my idea. I went out and bought these firecrackers myself. I found the exact string.
Different color.
Just different color.
Keith talked about how he did a bunch of different tests on it.
Woo, buddy.
Strung it up in the tree and lit the firecrackers off.
Doesn't look anything like the burn mark that was on the rope of the gun. The rope that was at the trial was just covered in those little tiny burns. My firecrackers did not put those black marks on it. I don't want to be guilty of perjury, but I was incorrect. That ain't it. Wasn't my string.
Finding out that it couldn't be his cord that was wrapped around the gun devastated him.
It didn't have burn marks, so I did him wrong.
Greg had surrounded himself with people who had complicated pasts. He believed in people. And one by one, they all rolled on him and then apologized or changed their stories. But you know, in the court, you can't do that. It's not like in church where you can apologize and then it's over. If you mess up in the court system and someone goes to prison for your mistake, you can't fix it. The impact of this reaches so far beyond just Greg. And so we're gonna go hang out with Joyce again at her house and meet Greg's daughter, Rebecca. So how often do you guys get to talk to Greg?
Well, whenever he calls, he's been calling almost every day for the past 2 or 3 weeks.
This call is from a correction facility and is subject to monitoring and recording.
Hi, Daddy.
Hey, sweetheart. How you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you?
So good. I'm doing good, too.
I love you, Daddy. Mwah. There's someone here who would really like to speak with you.
Hi, Greg. This is Hillary.
Hey, Hillary.
I have been digging into your situation. The state's case is that, you were getting foreclosed on and you were furious, and so you murdered them and set the house on fire.
There's no way, shape, or form or fashion that I'd commit this crime.
Have you interacted with anybody else who had knowledge of the crime while you've been there?
Yeah, they brought Billy Cleghorn in. That was in November of 1999.
Mm-hmm.
And I was walking around. It went like that. And, and I was like, what? He said, your name Greg Lance? And I said, yeah. He said, I know you didn't kill those people. But he knew who did it. He told me that Sam Horn was the real killer.
Who is Sam Horn?
Sam Horn. He lived across the road from the victim's house.
Just like Greg, Sam and Peggy Horn owed money to Victor.
They also had purchased their property from Victor on owner financing. They were way behind on their payments, so they were next in line to be foreclosed on.
So Billy seemed fairly convinced that Sam Horn was the killer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And is that when you were awaiting trial?
Right.
Was he ever called in during the trial to testify to that?
No, the court did not ever allow the jury to hear any evidence against Sam Horn.
The judge ruled that there was nothing to substantiate Billy's testimony, and therefore he did not allow the jury to hear it.
Here we have Billy Cleghorn telling us that Sam Horn killed Victor and Alla. How do you get that before the court for them to hear?
Through her investigation, Joyce found some people who knew the Horns. Sam and Peggy Horn were said to be the local meth dealers in Putnam County. Victor had threatened Sam and told him that if you don't catch the payments up on the mortgage, I'm going to call law enforcement and advise them that you're cooking meth over here.
The late 90s, the influx of methamphetamines in our area was huge because it was just cheap and easy money.
It was like the new drug, and a lot of people weren't educated about it.
It's all taking its toll on the community.
The Horns ran a meth lab in their kitchen, and they were known in Cookeville as the Murder Clan, which should tell you something. Wow. Yeah. We spoke to multiple witnesses who all knew Sam and Peggy Horn pretty well. And they told us that Sam and Peggy were over there at the Klesnikov's house the night it happened.
That's nuts.
Joyce hires an investigator, and they've collected statements from multiple people who knew the Horns. On November 26, 1999, Paula Locamore gave a statement that she heard Sam Horn made the statement he was going to kill the foreigners. Jackie Cleghorn gave a statement that Sam said that the best way to kill someone is to tape a flashlight to a gun and they cannot see you when you shoot them. Billy said that Samantha Horn, who is the daughter of Sam and Peggy Horn, saw her parents on the night of the murders, and they came back from across the street, and that they both smelled of gasoline. On June 14th, 2006, Paul Locamore gave a statement. Samantha stated that her mom went over to the residence and killed those people. Billy Cleghorn heard Peggy say she left her blouse over there, and she was afraid law enforcement was going to be able to tie it back to her. Chris Henry was a friend of Sam's. asked if he had ever shot a Tech-9. Chris Henry's response at that time was, not only have I shot a Tech-9, I shot Sam's Tech-9.
I have spoken to quite a few people in Sam and Peggy Horn's circle, and they've all pretty much told me the same story. It's a real killer still out there.
This is gorgeous.
It is beautiful.
So do you want to show me the Kalishnikov property first?
Sure, I'd love to. That's where the house was.
So directly in front of us, we have what was the Kalishnikov property, which went up in flames 3 o'clock in the morning. Right here, where we're seeing it from, is the driveway to the Horn house, which sat right past those bushes. This is so close.
Yes.
They're coming outside. I'm Hillary.
Hi,
How are
Hillary.
you?
Good.
When I spoke with you before, you were telling me about the Horns making meth out there.
Were they still here when you guys moved in?
Yeah, not for long.
Did you take over ownership of that property?
No, I was with the drug task force.
You were? So were they on your radar?
Oh, yeah.
And was it commonly known that they were involved in the business?
Well, the guys at the drug task force.
Uh-huh. So you think perhaps they were making meth in your barn?
I called one of my friends with a drug dog, and he said, there's so much stuff in there, I'm not putting him through.
Did you ever hear about any involvement on their end with what happened here at the Kalishnikovs?
And one weekend, I did a wiretap with Bob Krofsik, TBI.
Yeah.
He told me a bunch of stuff, but they thought they had their guy.
Yeah. So the Horns were on police radar. They were well known to law enforcement. I don't understand why the path of least resistance wasn't explored.
They just tunnel visioned in on Greg. You know, it's just amazing how difficult it is to get a wrong made right.
I'm Jessica Van Dyke. I'm Executive Director and Lead Counsel at the Tennessee Innocence Project. We became involved in Greg's case. We felt like we could move the case forward. In Tennessee, the only remaining options to him would be a DNA testing petition or a fingerprint testing petition.
We were pretty much at the end of the line unless we discovered some new evidence. I got very aggressive in sending out Freedom of Information Act letters. And so in 2015, I got the records from the Bomb and Arson Division in Nashville, and lo and behold, inside of that packet of records was a receipt for a shirt that was found on a picnic table at the Kalishnikovs' home by their son. I'm pretty certain that this shirt was the shirt that Peggy left over there at the scene.
And that blouse could be a critical piece of evidence in this case. It could potentially corroborate the testimony by a witness who said, one of the alternate suspects, that they left their blouse behind. And so maybe someone else really did this. So if we are able to test this evidence, and if it does support Greg's claim of innocence, then we would be asking a court to vacate his conviction, and the state would then have the option to either go forward with a new trial, or alternatively, they could just miss the charges and he would go free.
Greg's new legal team is working very hard to clear his name, but in cases like his, where there is already a conviction, it's an uphill battle. I found a circuit court judge here in Cookeville who was willing to talk to me about that. Hi, how are you?
Good, good. Come on in.
It seems impossible to overturn a wrongful conviction.
It is really hard because there's such a presumption that the jury got it right. Many times there were wrongful convictions, you know, especially where you have a high minority population. We don't really have that in the Upper Cumberland. I would stack our jurors up against anybody in the country. There's been some really tough decisions that the jurors have made, and I think they've got it right every time.
As we've dug deeper into this case, you have all these pods of people, and they all clash in this story. You've got the Kalishnikovs and the Horns and all the members of the trailer park, and the collision of those separate groups is tragic.
These murders changed my life and Becky's life and Keith's and definitely Greg's. Cookeville was a really small town. When I would go anywhere near anyone, they were looking at me like they thought I was involved in it. It was really hard. I mean, I lost custody of my kids. It was more than I could handle. Keith testified against somebody that he cared a lot about and believed that something happened that did not happen. And he really had a hard time living with that, and he worked hard at drinking himself to death.
My daddy's been locked up for 22 years, and I'll be 22 this August.
Oh, honey, that's a long time.
I've never seen him outside of prison. I want to see my daddy.
You deserve that. You do.
As much as Joyce wants answers and I want answers, Greg wants answers, I'm sure the victim's family would like to have the answers. There are a lot of missing pieces to this puzzle, and we all have a right to know the truth.
I cannot definitively say, yes, this other person did it. What I can say is that until that evidence testing happens, has justice really been served?